Did you know that food allergies and intolerances in children can impact not just the stomach, but also the brain, mood, behavior, and ability to focus? Even if your child hasn't been diagnosed with an allergy, you'll want to keep watching. We'll uncover symptoms that could indicate an intolerance you might not be aware of, and share 2 foods that you can eliminate almost immediately to help your child feel and function better. In my practice as a naturopathic doctor, I work mostly with adults, but when I do see children, gut health is almost always at the root of their concerns, with food intolerances frequently at the core. I'm thrilled to share my interview with Dr. Jensen and her expertise on children's health and practical tips for parents. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Jen.
You've been in practice for a long time, over
Yes.
25 years, and you still continue to research and write books. And I'm really curious, what has been your experience with seeing food, intolerances, and allergies and kids' behavior?
Yeah. Well, this started for me a long time ago. Prior to becoming a naturopathic doctor, I taught behavior problem kids, and they were all categorized into one area. We didn't recognize so much in the 70s, different learning disorders. And I started seeing behavior changes in the kids, often after they ate lunch. Their behavior would change, or after they ate snacks. And I had no idea about this at the time. And I have a very curious mind. And so I started wondering, like, what's going on here? And so I found the work of Dr. Doris Rapp. She is a board certified pediatrician, allergist. And I read everything I could of her work. And she became my mentor of sorts. And so then it was sort of a natural transition when I was in clinical practice after I became a naturopathic doctor to look for, say, different behavioral problems or learning problems in kids. And then I would try to assess what food might be involved.
Right. What sort of behavioral changes were you seeing?
It was a lot of it was behavior. They'd just become more aggressive or lack of motivation, or they just wouldn't be able to concentrate or think. It was just almost like this veil came down, and it was very confusing for me at the time until I learned more.
So how did Dr. Doris Rapp's work influence you with treating your patients?
Well, whenever a patient came to see me and I saw that they may have something related to foods, based on their intake and history, and I'd always have someone fill out a weekly diet sheet. I would look at and just start basically. Sometimes I would just say, well, you might want to avoid wheat, or you might want to avoid dairy, and just see what happened rather than putting through some of the more pricey, food sensitivity or food allergy testing.
Were you seeing that dairy and wheat were the 2 main culprits?
Yeah, I was actually. Wheat was a big one. And there's one case that I'll never forget. I'd been in practice, oh gosh, I would say about 18 years. I thought I'd seen everything, but I was wrong. This mother brought her son to see me. They'd traveled a great distance. And this child, he was about 8, and she said he came out like this. Like he was aggressive, he was moody, he would have temper tantrums all the time. And at school, he was always picking fights with others. He couldn't focus in school. And it was becoming such a problem that the school had said, if things don't change, he can't come back to school. So I was kind of their last resort, and they were desperate. And I honestly didn't know what to do. My jaw kind of hit the table. It was just unbelievable, in a child this young, seeing what I was seeing. And so I kept it simple. The family was already under way too much stress without me making things too complicated for them. So I removed wheat. Not dairy, just wheat and sugar, as much as they could. And I think I put them on a probiotic. That was it. And due to the distance they were traveling, I didn't see them at my normal follow-up. It was a longer period of time. And when they came back, I was almost afraid to say, how's your child doing? um, but the mother just looked at me and she had tears in her eyes and she said, we've never met our son before until now. So, it was a big ask. It might sound simple, but it was a really big ask, to ask them to avoid the wheat and to do everything they could, because most of their diet was wheat, pastas, breads, sugars to appease the child, if he was having a meltdown. And but they did, and they were desperate. So they made those changes very quickly. And then at some point, he'd been doing really well. He inadvertently was exposed to something at a barbecue. And his behavior within about 20 hours went right back
Wow.
to what it had been. But at least they knew what to do. And so it was a very delayed reaction.
But such profound impacts, right? To do those simple,
unbelievable.
can be difficult, but simple
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So you mentioned delayed, so 20 hours delayed. So there are, I understand, immediate
Yeah.
as well as delayed reactions. There's intolerances, allergies, sensitivities.
Right.
Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the differences between those two or those three things?
Well, a food allergy, which is what we're commonly sort of categorize everything as, when the body reacts to a food, it secretes antibodies. And an allergy is immunoglobulin E, IgE antibodies. And that's more with a very fast-acting reaction. It can be life-threatening, like anaphylaxis, from, say, a peanut allergy. And whereas an IgG, immunoglobulin G, can be more delayed, and the symptoms aren't pleasant, but they're not life-threatening. And so we refer to those more like sensitivities or intolerances, and those two terms are used interchangeably.
Right. Okay, and IgE or allergic reactions,
Right.
we tend not to, outgrow those so much,
No,
right? They
exactly.
tend to last a
And I don't think
lifetime.
we outgrow the IgG
Okay.
either,
Yeah.
in my experience.
Yeah. So with IgG intolerances or sensitivities, I know you mentioned briefly that you can test for these sorts of things. So what's that all about?
Well, you can test, but that can be expensive.
Okay.
So I usually would recommend to my patients first just doing an elimination diet. And I wouldn't necessarily start with, say, gluten. I would start with, say, just removing wheat and any products that contain wheat. It's a lot easier that way, because there's so many options, especially today. And then see what happens over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And if things improve, then they know, right, that the wheat's a problem.
Right. So
Right.
wheat sensitivity or gluten sensitivity is also different from celiac disease.
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
Celiac is an autoimmune reaction to a food in the gut. And the gut reacts to, say, glutens, the proteins in gluten, and, then starts a reaction that then damages the gut and it becomes really difficult, if not impossible, to absorb nutrients. And that can have a lot of varying effects down the road. Whereas a non-celiac gluten sensitivity is more systemically related. The reaction is more in the bloodstream, so it'll affect the body systemically and the brain.
Right. So it's going wherever the blood will go.
It's going
right?
wherever the blood will go.
So what other
Exactly.
symptoms are you seeing? I mean, you just mentioned the brain.
Well, I think, from what I've seen in my own experience, having a wheat sensitivity, I think the non-celiac gluten sensitivity is more brain.
Okay.
Brain fog, lack of concentration, people will get tired, they can get irritable, angry, and there's other symptoms too that are more physical, like skin disorders, headaches, heart palpitations, joint pain. I mean, the list goes on. It can pretty much be anything. Hives, they're not an IgE reaction. They're usually a reaction to some food, an overreaction of the immune system.
Okay. So Karen, with your experience with food sensitivities and allergies and intolerance, what are you seeing with the numbers?
Well, I just see them going up. In some areas it's epidemic. In some areas, 1 in 13 kids
Oh,
have been diagnosed with food allergy, and those aren't the ones that haven't been diagnosed,
right.
that aren't aware of it.
1 in
Right?
13, yeah.
Yeah,
It's going up.
yeah. And now they're finding too that it's estimated that non-gluten sensitivity is about 1 in 30. It's a
Okay.
huge problem
Mm-hmm.
based on what I had to live with for so long.
So why do you think the numbers are going up?
Oh, there's so many different reasons. I would say it's a lot of toxins, environmental exposures, not just in the environment, but in our foods, in our water, um, use of antibiotics, the gut brain, the gut microbiome, um, ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just generally the food that people are putting into their body on a daily basis. We've talked about it being the foundation. And everything that we put in, the immune system has to handle.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes to say that food is the biggest challenge that
Right.
the immune system has. So when the immune system has to overreact, and then it overreacts by causing, inflammatory reactions, and there's obviously going to be an increase in some of these things like allergies as well.
So that hypervigilance of our immune system, dealing
Exactly.
with all the toxins
Yeah,
and all
exactly.
the additives. Okay.
Yeah.
Karen, I've had the pleasure of knowing you for many years, which is wonderful, and I know a little bit about your health history. So you have a sensitivity. Is yours a wheat or gluten, or tell us more?
No, I'm a wheat. I'm sensitive to wheat.
Okay.
Not just wheat, but the entire wheat family.
Okay.
So kamut, spelt, wheat. But I'm okay with something like oats or rye or barley. Um, and whereas people with celiac disease, they can tolerate no gluten whatsoever. And for me, I lived like that until I was in my 40s. I had constantly swollen abdomen, painful abdomen all the time. I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome when I was young. And I just felt like my brain was just in a cloud. I think that was the hardest part. And it wasn't until I was going to naturopathic school that I found out that I was sensitive to wheat. And I was really skeptical. I thought, oh yeah, okay, fine, right.
We all are. Right.
But I thought, well, I was really struggling. I would be in school and I would do something I thought I was doing a really good job. I'd have this really healthy sandwich on whole wheat bread. And next thing I knew, I couldn't function. My brain was just turned off. I was either just wanted to crawl under the table and go to sleep. So I had to change and thought, well, I'll try it. And it was the first time in my life that the cobwebs were out of my brain. My abdomen became flat almost instantly. And I have not, by choice, eaten anything with wheat in it since the 1980s,
Wow.
which was really hard back then.
It was really hard. Yeah.
Really hard. I got so sick of salads, I can't tell
Yeah. A lot easier now. I
Yeah.
mean, in the grocery stores and restaurants to see that gluten-free,
Yeah.
meat-free option.
Yeah, there's a lot of options out there
Yeah.
now for kids and, sort of getting back to the elimination diet. It can be easier because in restaurants, they're usually indicated gluten-free or vegetarian. And even for someone that is sensitive or intolerant to, I can tolerate things that have been in a fryer, say with wheat
Right.
batter, whereas someone with celiac cannot.
Exactly.
So again, it opens up, options. There was a time where I inadvertently became exposed. I was with a friend and we'd stopped for lunch and I had a salad. and there was some fries left on her plate. And I said, hey, are you gonna eat those? And so anyway, I ate her fries and within, oh gosh, by the time we just finished and went up to, I could hardly function. And so I thought, oh. So I asked if there was flour on the fries. And so they checked, and sure enough, there was. Well, that's the first time I ever realized that now they're dipping, you know, fries in flour to make them nice and crisp. So, you really just have to be careful and read labels and double check and check again when you're in restaurants. People think that something is wheat-free or gluten-free, but it might not be.
Right. When you had that response or that reaction, how long did it take for you to feel normal again?
Oh, it takes me about 24 hours.
Okay.
Like I wasn't driving because I wouldn't have been able to. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too because just the rate of non-celiac gluten, which I'd mentioned, is about 1 in 30. And in some testing they did with autistic kids, they actually found that a really high percentage of them, I think it was in the 80s, had non-celiac gluten sensitive. They had an IgG reaction to wheat and 90% to casein, one of the proteins in dairy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really high one that I see with my patients
Yeah,
as well, especially if
exactly.
I do the testing. Outside of autism and that disorder, spectrum disorder, what are you seeing with other mental health conditions?
Well, definitely attention deficit disorder or other learning problems. I know, and if I can go by the way my brain reacted when I ate wheat, um, I just couldn't focus. Um, if I took my staff out to a staff meeting, out to a restaurant for a meeting, and I got too talkative, they would say, "Here, would you please have some pita?" Because it was wheat, right? And they knew that within about 5 or 10 minutes, I would just glaze over and not be able to talk anymore. So then they could just carry on having a good time.
Oh my goodness.
So, the wheat is, I think, the IgG, and I think is definitely more related to the brain, whereas obviously celiac or IgE has a totally different reaction.
So aside from these really common sensitivities or allergens like the dairy and the wheat and the components of that, like the casein and the
Right.
gluten, what about sugar?
Yeah, sugar's not considered an allergen as such, but it really does affect mental health. I would say more dramatically with kids and the maturing brain than adults, but it does affect everyone. And so people that eat a lot of sugar and then don't eat sugar, they start having meltdowns and they get angry and irritable because the blood sugar, they feel really good, so their blood sugar goes up and then their blood sugar crashes. So it's this constant up and down and up and down, and consequently an up and down with the emotional reactions as well. So that would be one of the things that I would definitely ask people to, if not completely eliminate, certainly reduce.
Yeah. Or just be mindful of where you're getting that sugar. You
Yeah.
may see that you're getting so much, and even
Yeah.
cutting that down by 50% can
Exactly.
be profound.
The
Yeah.
added sugars. I mean, okay, go ahead with your fruits if, and then be aware of that too. And yeah, because as you said, it adds up so quickly.
Yeah.
We talked about before.
Now, if I'm a parent with a child with having meltdowns and tantrums or not doing well in school, what are the first few steps that you would suggest to parents?
Well, I would certainly be aware that it could be an allergy or sensitivity. I would see a naturopath that could not only help guide, through the assessments, but also help, deal with that and help with that in a way that wouldn't, create too much stress in the family life.
Now, speaking about stress and family life and all the things that go on, what about when your child is going to, events or parties or sleepovers and they may have been diagnosed with a sensitivity? How do you navigate that?
Right. Well, I think, say at school, if you know that there's going to be one of the classmates are having a birthday party and the child may be allergic to wheat, then the child could bring their own cake so they don't feel left out. You could make the teachers, or caregivers more aware that this is something that the child reacts to. And what I find with my grandkids, and they range between 6 and 12 years old, that if they're at, say, my son's house and there's something, they'll just simply say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't eat that." And so they're very aware that this is something that doesn't affect them in a good way.
I think kids are so, they're able to see the differences when they cut out those foods much more quickly.
Right.
Like an onion, they have fewer layers. And
Right.
so taking that away from their
Exactly.
system, it does have profound effects. I know when I treat kids with intolerances or sensitivities, they become aware of that symptom that they were trying to avoid and, or stay away from, and not have that sore tummy or the constant runny
Exactly.
nose. And they become empowered, right? They are more
Exactly.
empowered, they are educated,
Yeah.
and they feel confident in avoiding those foods and saying, I'm okay, I don't need to eat that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that was more just older kids, but I'm seeing that, like my little granddaughter, she's just 6, and her friend next door, she can't eat wheat, and she has a very strict diet, and she's very adamant about not being able to eat those foods.
Yeah.
So I'm going, good for you.
Yeah.
This is great.
Great role models,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing too, as parents, you've said it, is to be a role model, on the foods we eat, because I think parents pick up, or kids pick up from the behavior of their parents. So if you're out in a restaurant or something, then perhaps order, a protein with vegetables rather than a burger and fries. And then, maybe eventually the kids will start doing that.
Yeah. Let's hope.
Let's hope. Yeah.
Do you have any patient stories that you can share with us about eliminating certain foods and the effects that had?
Well, yeah, there's several. I'm sure you do as well. I remember I was fairly new in practice, I think, and a mother brought her daughter to see me. I think she was around 10, and she'd had terrible intestinal problems, headaches all the time. She was depressed, and her uncle was actually a gastroenterologist, so they had certainly done all the testing. She was given a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, but she still had all these symptoms. So in listening and through my own experience, I removed wheat, and definitely, and based on her history too, she'd been on a lot of antibiotics when she was young, so I put her on what we called back then a candida diet, which was now referred to as dysbiosis, which is simply, restoring the good microbes, to the gut microbiome, and avoiding certain foods that feed the bad microbes. And I don't think I did really much anything else, really. Educated them about, say diet similar to the Mediterranean diet, which was not called that then. But so when they came back, she was much better. Her headaches were gone. She was much less depressed, and she just had no intestinal pain anymore. But the really exciting part was, as she grew up and had children, the whole family's lifestyle changed at that point when they were changed for their daughter. And then when she grew up, she raised her children that way.
Wow.
And then, gosh, not that long ago, well, it seems not that long ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I actually got a call. She hunted me down, and she was now an adult. Her kids were probably even grown up, and she was having some issues, and she'd been good all these years. So I just listened, and I made a few basic suggestions, and I said, well, call me if this doesn't help. And I never heard back. So I'm assuming that, things improved.
Wow.
But that's what's really exciting, is when you can see things transfer through the generation and the education, and, how this family took it very seriously as far as not only the health for her, but their entire family.
You've impacted so many in that one story only.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to hear
And
that.
I think that's what keeps us going.
I think so. That's really what got me into naturopathic medicine as well. Is just hearing these stories and getting to live them as well.
Exactly.
In
It
practice.
keeps the passion and enthusiasm alive.
Yeah.